It was late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. I had been in the garage for most of the day, tinkering with my car, trying to distract myself from the endless monotony of the weekend. The garage had always been my escape, a place where I could clear my head, surrounded by the smell of oil and metal, the familiar clink of tools against concrete. But today, it wasn't working. My thoughts kept drifting, wandering to places they shouldn't. It didn't help that across the street, my neighbor's daughter Maddie had been spending more time around the house lately. She had just finished her first year of college, and ever since she'd returned home for the summer, it seemed like she was always nearby, whether it was lounging by the pool in her parents' backyard or running errands that conveniently brought her by my place. Maddie had always been friendly, always quick with a smile and a wave when she passed by. But recently, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us. I'd catch her watching me out of the corner of her eye, her gaze lingering just a little too long, her smile just a little too knowing. It was subtle, but unmistakable. I tried to push it out of my mind, telling myself that I was overthinking things. She was young, full of life, and probably just enjoying her summer break. But there was something in the way she looked at me, something that sent a shiver down my spine, even when I tried to ignore it. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, my shirt sticking to my back from the heat. The day had been stifling, the garage only adding to the oppressive warmth, and I was about ready to call it quits when I heard footsteps approaching from the driveway. I turned, expecting to see one of the neighbors, maybe Maddie's father coming over to chat about the car. But instead, there she was. Maddie, standing in the doorway, her eyes bright and curious, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. "Hey," she said, leaning casually against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her chest. "You've been out here all day. Figured you could use a break." I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, just trying to get some things done before it gets too late." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze wandering over the car and then back to me. "Looks like you're almost finished, but you don't look like you're having much fun." I chuckled nervously, rubbing the back of my neck. "It's just one of those days, you know?" She nodded, stepping further into the garage, her eyes never leaving mine. There was something about the way she moved, confident, deliberate, that made my pulse quicken. She wasn't the shy, quiet girl I remembered from years ago. There was a new edge to her, a boldness that was hard to ignore. "Mind if I hang out for a bit?" she asked, her voice casual. But there was an underlying note that I couldn't quite place. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The air in the garage felt heavier now, charged with something I didn't fully understand. But I nodded, stepping aside to make room for her as she moved closer. "Sure," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "It's not exactly exciting, though." She smiled, her eyes glinting with amusement. "I'm not looking for excitement." There was something in her voice, something that sent a jolt of awareness through me. I tried to focus on the car, on the tools scattered across the workbench, but I could feel her eyes on me, could sense the shift in the air between us. We stood there in silence for a few moments, the sound of the neighborhood fading into the background, replaced by the quiet hum of tension that seemed to fill the space. Maddie leaned against the workbench, her fingers idly tracing the edge of a wrench, her gaze fixed on me. "You've been different lately," she said suddenly, her voice soft but steady. Quieter, more distant. Her words caught me off guard, and I looked up, meeting her gaze. There was no judgment in her eyes, just curiosity, maybe even concern. But there was something else there too, something that made my heart race. "I've just had a lot on my mind," I replied, my voice tight. She took a step closer, her presence filling the small space between us. "You know, you don't have to pretend with me." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening as she moved closer still, her fingers brushing lightly against my arm. The touch was brief, barely there, but it sent a shiver down my spine, a spark of something dangerous igniting between us. "Maddie," I began, but the words caught in my throat. She didn't say anything, just looked up at me, her eyes wide and full of something I couldn't quite name. There was a tension between us now, thick and undeniable, and I could feel my resolve slipping. This was wrong. I knew it was wrong. But the way she was looking at me, the way her body seemed to lean toward mine, made it impossible to think straight. "I've noticed the way you look at me," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I know you've noticed too." Her words hung in the air, heavy and charged. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, my pulse quickening as the implications of what she had just said settled over me like a weight. I looked at her, trying to find some hint of a joke, some playful smirk that would tell me she was teasing. But her expression remained serious. Her eyes locked onto mine, unwavering, and I could see the quiet confidence there, the certainty that we both knew exactly what she was talking about. "Maddie, I started, my voice trailing off as I struggled to find the right words. She took another step closer, her fingers still brushing against the edge of the workbench, but her focus entirely on me. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. I needed you to know that I've noticed it too, that I've felt it too." The tension between us was unbearable now, the air in the garage thick with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. I wanted to tell her this was wrong, that we shouldn't be here, like this, so close to crossing a line we couldn't uncross. But instead, I stood there, frozen, torn between what I knew was right and the overwhelming pull I felt toward her. "Maddie, you're my neighbor's daughter," I managed to say, though the words felt hollow, weak. "This isn't—" "I know," she said quickly, cutting me off. "I know it's not supposed to be like this, but that doesn't change the way I feel. It doesn't change what's been happening between us." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had tried to deny it, tried to push it out of my mind every time I saw her, every time our eyes met across the yard or when she walked by with that easy smile on her lips. But now, with her standing so close, her breath warm against my skin, it was impossible to ignore. She reached out then, her fingers grazing my arm, a touch so soft and fleeting that it sent a jolt through me, like a spark catching fire. My breath hitched in my throat, and for a moment, the world outside the garage seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of us standing there, suspended in the charged air between us. "You don't have to pretend anymore," she whispered, her voice low, intimate. "I can see it in your eyes. I know you've been thinking about it. Just like I have." Her hand lingered on my arm, her touch light but insistent, and I could feel the heat rising between us, a slow, simmering burn that threatened to consume us both. My heart was racing now, my mind a tangled mess of desire and guilt, fear and longing. I should have pulled away, should have stepped back and told her this couldn't happen, that we had to stop before things went too far. But instead, I found myself moving closer, the space between us shrinking with every breath. "Maddie," I whispered, my voice trembling. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and filled with something that sent my pulse racing. "I don't want to stop," she murmured, her fingers tightening their grip on my arm. Neither did I. Before I could stop myself, I reached out, my hand finding her waist, pulling her gently toward me. Her body pressed against mine, soft and warm, and I could feel the rapid beat of her heart, the same frantic rhythm that echoed in my own chest. My mind screamed that this was wrong, that I should let go, walk away, but my body refused to listen. The tension that had been building between us for weeks, maybe even longer, finally reached its breaking point. Her lips parted slightly, her breath shallow, and before I could think twice, I leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that was slow, hesitant, but filled with all the unspoken desire that had been simmering between us. The moment our lips touched, it was like something inside both of us snapped. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more desperate, as if we had both been holding back for too long and could no longer resist. Her hands slid up to my shoulders, pulling me closer, and I responded in kind, my arms wrapping around her, holding her against me as the kiss grew more intense. I could feel the heat between us, the electricity that had been building with every lingering glance, every accidental touch, and now that it had been unleashed, there was no stopping it. My hands roamed down her back, pulling her tighter against me, and I could feel her body responding, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts as our kiss deepened. For a long time we stayed like that, tangled together in the dimly lit garage, our bodies pressed close, the rest of the world fading away as the heat between us burned brighter. It was all-consuming, overwhelming, and I knew in that moment that there was no turning back. But just as quickly as it had started, the weight of reality came crashing down around us. Maddie pulled back slightly, her lips swollen from our kiss, her eyes wide with a mixture of desire and confusion. "We shouldn't be doing this," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of what we had just done. I nodded, though my body ached to pull her back into my arms, to lose myself in her again. "I know." But neither of us moved. The guilt was already creeping in, the reality of the situation settling over us like a heavy fog. And yet, even as the weight of it pressed down on me, I couldn't shake the desire that still lingered just beneath the surface. "Maddie, we can't," I began, but my voice trailed off as she looked up at me, her eyes filled with something that mirrored the conflict I felt inside. "I don't want to stop," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I swallowed hard, my heart racing as her words sank in. "Neither do I admitted softly. The confession hung in the air between us, thick and heavy, but neither of us made a move to leave. The tension was still there, simmering beneath the surface, unresolved, and I knew that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. "I should go," Maddie said suddenly, her voice shaky as she stepped back, her hands falling away from me. I nodded, but the thought of her leaving, of this ending, made my chest tighten with something I couldn't quite name. I didn't want her to go. I didn't want this to be over, even though I knew it should be. She hesitated for a moment longer, her eyes lingering on mine, and for a brief second I thought she might stay, that she might say something that would change everything. But then, without another word, she turned and slipped out of the garage, leaving me standing there in the silence, the weight of what we had just done pressing down on me like a heavy stone. I stood there for a long time after she left, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, my heart still pounding in my chest. The guilt, the desire, the confusion. It was all too much, too overwhelming. And yet, even as I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I couldn't shake the memory of her touch, the way her body had felt against mine, the way we had both given in to something we couldn't control. The pull between us was still there, lingering in the air, unresolved. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. The hours after Maddie left were a blur. I stayed in the garage, pacing, trying to process everything. The tools and the half-finished project on the car, once a distraction, now seemed insignificant, pale in comparison to what had just happened. My thoughts circled the same point over and over. How had I let it go this far? What was I thinking? Maddie was young, barely into her 20s, and I was her neighbor. Her father and I had been friendly for years. What would he think if he found out? The shame was a weight on my shoulders, but even worse than the shame was the nagging desire that wouldn't go away. The lingering feeling of her lips on mine, the warmth of her body pressed so close. It had all felt so right, even though it was so wrong. I leaned against the workbench, staring out into the fading light of the evening. The garage door was still cracked open, and a breeze drifted in, carrying the sounds of the neighborhood. The distant hum of a lawnmower, the laughter of kids playing down the street. Everything seemed normal outside, while my world felt like it had tipped upside down. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, lost in my thoughts, when my phone buzzed on the workbench. I grabbed it, half expecting it to be Maddie, though I wasn't sure what I'd do if it was. But it wasn't her. It was her father, Jeff. A simple message. "Want to grab a beer later?" My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I could barely breathe. I stared at the text, feeling the weight of what I had just done settle even heavier on my chest. The idea of sitting with Jeff, sharing a casual drink, while this secret loomed over me. I didn't know if I could do it, but I couldn't ignore him either. I typed back quickly, my fingers shaking. "Sure, sounds good." I set the phone down, feeling the tension in my body grow. This was only going to get more complicated. The next few days were a dance of avoidance. I saw Maddie from a distance, in her front yard, or passing by in her car, but I made sure to keep my head down, to stay busy. But every time I saw her, that same pull was there. I tried to ignore it, tried to remind myself that what had happened in the garage was a mistake. A line crossed that couldn't be undone, but the more I tried to forget, the more the memory of that kiss burned into my mind. It didn't help that Maddie didn't seem to be avoiding me. If anything, she seemed to go out of her way to be around. I'd catch her lingering by the mailbox when I was outside, or walking slowly past the garage when I had the door open. There was a part of me that wanted to confront her, to tell her that this couldn't happen again, that we needed to stop before things spiraled out of control. But another part of me, the part that had let that kiss happen in the first place, wanted to see her again, to feel that connection once more. It wasn't until the weekend that things finally came to a head. I had just finished mowing the lawn and was putting the mower away in the garage when I heard footsteps behind me. My stomach tightened. I knew who it was before I even turned around. Maddie stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze steady and unflinching. There was something different in her eyes this time, something more determined, more certain. The playful teasing that had been there before was gone, replaced with a seriousness that made my pulse quicken. "We need to talk," she said softly, her voice steady, but her eyes searching mine. I set the mower down and wiped my hands on a rag, trying to buy myself a moment to gather my thoughts. But I knew there was no avoiding this conversation. Not anymore. "Maddie, we can't," I began, but she cut me off. "I know what you're going to say," she said quickly, stepping further into the garage, closing the door behind her. "I know it was a mistake. I know it shouldn't have happened." She paused, her voice softening. "But that doesn't change the way I feel." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening as she stepped closer. The space between us felt small, too small, and I could feel the familiar tension building between us again, the same pull that had drawn us together in the first place. "Maddie, this is dangerous," I said, my voice low, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince her or myself. "You know that." She nodded, her gaze never leaving mine. "I know, but I don't care." Her words sent a shock through me, and for a moment I was speechless. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the same struggle I was feeling inside. But there was also something else, something undeniable. The desire was still there, simmering beneath the surface. And no matter how much I told myself this had to stop, I couldn't deny that part of me wanted this, wanted her. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Since that day in the garage, I can't get it out of my head." I let out a shaky breath, my heart racing as her words washed over me. I should have told her to leave, to walk away and never come back. But instead I found myself stepping toward her, my body betraying me, drawn to her like a magnet. "Maddie," I whispered, my voice breaking. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Tell me you don't feel the same," she whispered. "Tell me you don't want this too, and I'll leave." I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to say it, wanted to tell her to leave, to end this before it went any further. But the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was, I did want this. I wanted her. And no matter how wrong it was, no matter how much guilt clawed at me, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. I closed the distance between us in one swift motion, my hands finding her waist and pulling her against me. Her breath hitched, her lips parting in surprise, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into me, her hands sliding up my chest, her fingers curling into the fabric of my shirt as she kissed me. Soft at first, then more urgently, as if all the tension that had been building between us had finally snapped. I kissed her back, my hands roaming up her back, pulling her closer, deeper into the kiss. The garage felt too small, too hot, the air thick with the weight of everything we weren't saying. Her body pressed against mine, soft and warm, and I could feel the rapid beat of her heart, the same frantic rhythm that echoed in my own chest. For a long time, we stayed like that, tangled together in the dimly lit garage, lost in the heat of the moment. The guilt, the fear, the consequences, they all faded away, replaced by the overwhelming need to be closer, to feel more. Every touch, every kiss, was filled with the tension that had been simmering between us for so long. And now that it had finally been unleashed, there was no stopping it. But as the kiss deepened, as our hands grew more desperate, the reality of what we were doing began to creep back in. Maddie pulled back slightly, her breath coming in short gasps, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of desire and confusion. "We can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, though every part of me ached to pull her back into my arms. "I know." But even as we both said the words, neither of us moved. The connection between us hadn't been broken. If anything, it had only grown stronger, more dangerous. Maddie stood there, her eyes locked on mine, the weight of our actions pressing down on both of us, but neither of us willing to step away. Her breath was uneven, her chest rising and falling quickly, and I could feel the warmth of her skin where her hand rested lightly on my arm. For a moment, we just stood there, suspended in the thick tension between us. It was as if we were both waiting for something, waiting for the other to say something, to break the silence, to pull back before it was too late. But neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. Her hand slid down from my arm to my chest, her fingers splayed out across my shirt, and the touch sent a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the familiar pull between us, stronger now, more dangerous. Every rational thought told me to stop, to pull away before we crossed another line, but her presence overwhelmed all logic. "Maddie, this is..." I began, my voice trailing off as she stepped closer, her body pressing lightly against mine. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her eyes searching mine. "I know it's wrong, but I can't stop thinking about it, about you." Her confession hit me like a punch to the gut. It was everything I had been feeling, everything I had tried to deny, wrapped up in a few simple words. And hearing her say it out loud only made it harder to resist. "I don't want to hurt anyone," I said softly, though the words felt hollow. I was already in too deep, and we both knew it. She nodded, her gaze never leaving mine. "Neither do I. But I can't help how I feel." Her hand lingered on my chest, and I could feel her fingers tremble slightly against my skin, a subtle sign of the conflict she was feeling. The air between us was thick with unspoken emotions, a tension that had been building for far too long. I swallowed hard, my heart racing as her hand slipped lower, her fingers brushing against the waistband of my jeans. My breath caught in my throat, my body reacting before my mind could catch up. I should have stopped her, should have pulled away before things went any further, but I couldn't. "Maddie," I whispered, my voice rough with desire and guilt. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, filled with a mixture of fear and longing. "Tell me to stop," she said softly. "Tell me, and I'll stop." But I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The silence stretched between us, thick and charged, and I knew in that moment that I had already made my decision. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. I reached out, my hand cupping her cheek, and she leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment as if she had been waiting for this. "I don't want you to stop," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes snapped open, and for a second, everything seemed to freeze. The air was heavy, the weight of what we were about to do pressing down on us, but neither of us moved. And then, as if a dam had broken, we crashed together, our lips meeting in a kiss that was frantic, desperate, filled with all the pent-up desire that had been simmering between us. This time, there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. The kiss deepened quickly, her hands moving up to my shoulders, pulling me closer as I wrapped my arms around her, holding her against me. The heat between us was overwhelming, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, but none of them made sense. The kiss grew more intense, more urgent, and before I knew it, we were stumbling backward, her back hitting the wall of the garage with a soft thud. She gasped against my lips, her fingers tightening their grip on my shirt as I pressed her against the wall, the tension between us boiling over into something neither of us could control. Every touch, every kiss, was filled with the weight of everything we had been holding back. Her body fit perfectly against mine, and I could feel the rapid beat of her heart, the same frantic rhythm that echoed in my own chest. The guilt, the fear, the consequences, they were all still there, lingering in the back of my mind. But they were drowned out by the overwhelming need to be closer to her, to feel more. Her hands slid up into my hair, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened, and I could feel the heat of her skin through the thin fabric of her shirt. My hands roamed down her sides, pulling her tighter against me, and I could hear the soft moan that escaped her lips as I kissed her harder, more desperately. For a long time we stayed like that, tangled together in the small space of the garage, lost in the heat of the moment. It was all-consuming, overwhelming, and I knew in that moment that we had crossed a line that could never be undone. The connection between us, the pull that had drawn us together, was too strong to ignore, and there was no going back now. But just as quickly as it had started, the weight of reality came crashing back in. Maddie pulled away, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she looked up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. Her lips were swollen from our kiss, her hair tousled, and she looked so vulnerable, so conflicted, that my heart ached. "We can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of what we had just done. I nodded, though every part of me wanted to pull her back into my arms, to lose myself in her again. "I know." But neither of us moved. The guilt was already creeping in, the reality of the situation settling over us like a heavy fog. And yet, even as the weight of it pressed down on me, I couldn't shake the desire that still lingered just beneath the surface. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted softly, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to walk away from this." I swallowed hard, my heart aching at the pain in her voice. "I don't either." We stood there in silence for a long time, the tension still thick between us, the weight of everything we had just done pressing down on us. I wanted to say something, to fix this, but I didn't know how. I didn't know if it was even possible. "I should go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, but the thought of her leaving, of this ending, made my chest tighten with something I couldn't quite name. I didn't want her to go. I didn't want this to be over, even though I knew it should be. She took a small step back, her eyes never leaving mine, and I could see the conflict, the guilt, the desire all swirling together in her gaze. It mirrored everything I was feeling, everything I couldn't bring myself to say. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't be," I replied, though the words felt hollow. We both knew there was nothing to apologize for, nothing that would make this any less complicated, any less painful. Maddie hesitated for a moment longer, her hand lingering on the door handle as if she wasn't sure if she could bring herself to leave. And for a brief second, I thought she might stay, that she might say something that would change everything. But then, without another word, she opened the door and slipped out into the fading light of the evening, leaving me standing there in the silence of the garage. I stood there for a long time after she left, my mind racing, my heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. The desire, the guilt, the confusion, it was all too much, too overwhelming. And yet, even as I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The pull between us was still there, lingering in the air, unresolved. And I knew, deep down, that no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I wasn't ready to walk away.